Imagine the smell of blood and incense mingling in the July heat of 1099. Imagine the sound of 50,000 voices, screaming, praying, weeping, all at once, in the same narrow streets where, according to three of the world's great religions, God himself had walked. The gates of Jerusalem had just been breached. The Crusaders were inside. And what happened next would echo through 1,000 years of history, shaping wars, borders, and grudges that still pulse like open wounds in our world today. But here is the question that historians have wrestled with for centuries, the question that most textbooks quietly sidestep. Was the Kingdom of Jerusalem a miracle of medieval ambition, or was it one of the most catastrophically hubristic political experiments the world has ever seen? Because what these warriors from the cold, muddy fields of France and England and the Rhine Valley built in the desert was extraordinary, a kingdom unlike any other. A place where the architecture was Byzantine, the population was Muslim, Jewish, and Christian in equal measure, the laws were borrowed from a dozen different traditions, and the throne was fought over with a savagery that would make even the most hardened medieval king flinch. They carved a nation out of holy sand with their bare hands and their bloodied swords, and then, less than 90 years later, they watched it crumble. The question is not simply why it fell. Every kingdom falls. The question, the one that should keep you awake at night, is how it ever stood at all and what it cost the world when it finally didn't. To understand the Kingdom of Jerusalem, you have to go back before the kingdom. You have to go back to the road. Because the First Crusade was not a polished military operation. It was, by almost any measure, an act of collective madness dressed up in the language of divine mission. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood in a field in Clermont, France, and delivered a speech so electrifying that the crowd reportedly drowned him out with a single chanted phrase, Deus vult, God wills it. Deus vult, God wills it. Within months, hundreds of thousands of people, knights and peasants and priests and women and children, were marching east toward in a land most of them could not have found on a map. The journey alone killed tens of thousands. Starvation, disease, ambush, infighting among the Crusader lords themselves, these thinned the ranks before a single wall was scaled. And yet they arrived. And yet they conquered. But here is what the triumphalist narrative always skips over. The internal war that almost destroyed the Crusade before it reached its destination. The great lords of the expedition, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and others, despised each other with a ferocity that was barely contained by shared religious purpose. These were not unified soldiers under a single command. They were rival aristocrats, each with his own ambitions, each calculating what personal empire he might carve from the ruins of the Islamic Near East. They quarreled over Antioch. They quarreled over territory. They nearly came to blows repeatedly. The real miracle of his First Crusade is not that they captured Jerusalem. The real miracle is that they managed not to destroy each other first. And that tension, that fundamental fracture between collective mission and individual ambition, would become the fatal DNA of the kingdom they built. Jerusalem fell on July 15th, 1099. The sources, both Christian and Islamic, describe what followed with a uniformity that no historian can soften into comfort. The slaughter was enormous. The streets ran red. The surviving population, Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city, were killed or enslaved in numbers that shocked even contemporary observers on both sides. Within days, the victorious lords had to decide who would rule this kingdom. Godfrey of Bouillon was offered the crown and refused the title of king, saying he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He accepted instead the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a small distinction, a revealing one. From its very first breath, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a place where symbolism and reality existed in permanent, uncomfortable tension. The kingdom that followed was a genuinely remarkable political construction. At its height, it stretched from the Sinai to the borders of modern Lebanon. It had a sophisticated feudal legal code. It had a functioning bureaucracy. It had extraordinary castles, Crac des Chevaliers, Belvoir, Carac, engineering achievements so formidable that military historians still study their geometry with open admiration. These were not temporary encampments. These were the bones of a civilization. But the kingdom was always surrounded, always outnumbered, always dependent on a steady stream of new recruits, money, and political will from a distant and increasingly distracted Europe. And then came the moment that made all of it irrelevant. In the summer of 1187, at a place called the Horns of Hattin, a volcanic ridge above the Sea of Galilee, in the kind of July heat that turns the air itself into a weapon, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, drew the entire military force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem into the open and destroyed it. Not defeated it, destroyed it. The Crusader army, some 15,000 strong, was surrounded, cut off from water for 2 days in catastrophic heat, and then annihilated. The king was captured. The true cross, The most sacred relic in the kingdom, the spiritual heartbeat of the entire Crusader project, was taken. Jerusalem surrendered 3 months later. Saladin, in a decision that stunned and confounded his enemies, allowed the Christian population to ransom themselves and leave in relative safety. The contrast with 1099 was not lost on anyone. It was a political and moral statement written in mercy rather than blood, and it echoed across the medieval world like a thunderclap. Now here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not simply a kingdom of crusading knights and pious pilgrims, it was also a kingdom built on the systematic exploitation of the people who already lived there. The native Christian population, Arab, Greek, Armenian, occupied a legal status below the Frankish settlers. The Muslim and Jewish populations lived under a complex web of restrictions, tributary relationships, and periodic violence. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, were among the most formidable military organizations the medieval world ever produced. But they were also extraordinarily wealthy institutions, with landholdings across Europe, and their rivalry with each other and with the crown contributed directly to the political paralysis that made Hattin possible. There's a darker thread still. The internal politics of the kingdom in its final decades were so dysfunctional, so corroded by personal vendetta and factional warfare among the Frankish nobility, that historians have argued, persuasively, that the kingdom essentially chose its own destruction. The disastrous decision-making that led to Hattin was not forced on the Crusaders by external circumstances alone. It was the product of a ruling class so consumed by its own internal power struggles that it could not execute a coherent military strategy even when survival itself was the stake. The man most directly responsible for the catastrophic march to Hattin, Raynald of Châtillon, a knight of astonishing recklessness who had repeatedly violated peace treaties with Saladin for personal profit, and who essentially gave Saladin the justification he needed to launch his campaign, represents something worth sitting with. The kingdom was not simply destroyed from outside, it was also devoured from within. Stand in Jerusalem today, walk the Via Dolorosa. Run your hand along the stones of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Look at the dome of the rock catching the afternoon light and turning it into something that defies description. You are standing in a place that has been fought over, burned, rebuilt, fought over again, and rebuilt again so many times that the layers of civilization beneath your feet are almost incomprehensible in their depth. The Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted 88 years in its first incarnation. 88 years. Less than a human lifetime. And yet its shadow is so vast that we are still standing inside it. The Crusades, of which the Kingdom of Jerusalem was the central animating project, shaped the relationship between the Christian West and the Islamic world in ways that have never fully healed. The word itself, crusade, is still politically radioactive. It is still weaponized in speeches and manifestos on every side of every conflict in that region and beyond. The military architecture the Crusaders left behind still stands in places, defiant and impossible, rising from the desert like the memory of an argument that was never resolved. And the fundamental questions the kingdom raised about who has the right to a holy city, about how diverse populations can share sacred space, about what happens when religious mission collides with political reality, these are not historical questions. They are this morning's news. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was not a glorious success. It was not a simple atrocity. It was something far more interesting and far more disturbing than either of those convenient verdicts. It was an experiment in building civilization in the middle of a contradiction. A Christian kingdom in a land that was already home to millions who were not Christian, sustained by violence, animated by genuine faith, consumed by human weakness, and remembered by everyone. The real question, the one the history books cannot answer for you, the one you have to answer yourself, is whether we have learned a single thing from watching it rise and watching it fall.